The laughter reached her through the dining room door before her hand touched the handle, and she understood it at once, not the generous laughter of a room in high spirits, but the particular bright cruelty of men amusing themselves at the expense of someone not yet present. She knew the sound. She had grown up inside it. What she did not know, stepping across that threshold with the housekeeper's candles throwing her shadow long across the flagstones, was that before the fish course was cleared, she would say something in this room that men would quote for the rest of their lives, and that the Duke seated at the head of that long table would remember it every morning of his remaining years whenever he reached for the seal on his correspondence. She knew none of that. She knew only that her name was Agnes Vane, that she had 22 shillings in a tin box under her traveling trunk, that she had been engaged as companion to the Countess of Ashmore for a sum that would keep her mother's creditors at bay until Michaelmas, and that Michaelmas was 11 weeks away. The dining room at Ashmore Park was the kind of room built to make a person feel the precise weight of what they lacked. The ceiling floated somewhere in the candlelit dark, above a table that could have seated 4 and 30. At present, it seated 9, and the 9 had arranged themselves with the instinctive cruelty of the comfortable, leaving a gap at the foot that announced itself as the place not wanted. Agnes had been told to attend the Countess at dinner on evenings. The Countess felt well enough to come down. The Countess, pale and fond, and presently very well indeed, sat midway along the right side and was looking at Agnes with an expression of anxious apology that had, Agnes thought, arrived at least 2 minutes too late. It was Lord Fenwick who had made the remark. She worked this out afterward from the way the laughter had pooled around that end of the table, from the slight frost in the Dowager Lady Ashmore's profile, and from the way Fenwick himself, lean, well-made, with the face of a man who had never been denied anything that mattered to him, did not lower his eyes when she entered. He raised them. He had the particular boldness of a man who has just said a clever thing and sees no reason to be ashamed of it. She found her place. The footman drew out the chair. Agnes sat. Miss Vane, the Countess. "I am so glad you came down. I was saying to Fenwick that you are a remarkable linguist. Were you not, Fenwick? I believe what I said was rather more precise than that, my lady." "Indeed," said the woman to his left, a Mrs. Stanhope in green silk who wore her condescension like jewelry, well polished and long habitual. What Lord Fenwick said was that a girl with 20 shillings for a dowry had better have Latin for it. She produced a small, airy smile in Agnes's direction, only he said it rather more prettily than that. In Latin. Agnes set her napkin across her lap. She folded it with some care, corner to corner, because her hands wished to do something other than sit still, and the napkin could absorb it. She looked at Lord Fenwick. He was watching her with the pleasant, expectant attention of a man at a sport. She let the silence run one full beat longer than was comfortable. Then, in Latin, in the register of Cicero's private correspondence rather than his speeches, the register a man used with his intellectual equals, not his audience, she said, a man who mistakes the price of a thing for its worth will make expensive errors all his life. I have found this observation holds equally well in 5 other languages, should you prefer the demonstration. She said it without raising her voice. She had never needed to. The room went silent in the way of a room that has just heard something its members cannot immediately classify. Fenwick's wineglass completed its journey to his lips and returned to the table before he permitted himself an expression. Across from Agnes, an older gentleman she would later learn, was Sir Edmund Crail, the Countess's uncle, retired from 3 decades of correspondence with half the learned institutions in Europe, set down his fork with the deliberate care of a man suppressing visible delight. At the head of the table, the Duke of Ashmore said nothing. Agnes had been aware of him the way one is aware of a source of heat in a cold room, without looking directly. He was perhaps 38, broad through the shoulder, with hands that were not a duke's hands, and the particular stillness of a man who was always listening and who trusted almost no one. He had not laughed with the others. She filed that away. "Well," said Mrs. Stanhope, after an interval. "Quite," said Sir Edmund, and reached for his wine with the air of a man settling in to enjoy the evening. Fenwick recovered with the speed of the very practiced. "I stand corrected," he said in English, and made of it something almost graceful. Agnes turned her attention to her soup. That was the first evening. It was the first of 73, before everything broke open. The Countess of Ashmore was 32 and fond and not very well. Though the not very well came and went in waves that corresponded, Agnes noticed within a fortnight, to the weeks in which her brother visited. Cornelius Ashmore was 3 years the Countess's junior, fair where she was dark, and beautiful in the way of things that are perfectly made for a specific function. He managed the estate accounts during the Duke's absences, which were frequent and unexplained. He spoke to Agnes, when he spoke to her at all, with the gentle inattention of a man confirming that a door is closed before turning back to the room. Agnes's work was simple and was not simple. She read aloud to the Countess in the evenings. She wrote the Countess's correspondence when the headaches were bad. She kept the Countess's accounts, because the Countess had been educated in the accomplishments and not in arithmetic, and because the Countess's quarterly receipts from her marriage settlement passed through Agnes's hands for reconciliation before Cornelius collected them and forwarded them to whatever account handled such things. Agnes was not trained as a bookkeeper. She had learned at her father's side, and her father had been a man of business until the business had come undone, and what he had given her, the last year before he died, was a mind that looked at columns of figures the way other people look at faces, reading them for what they withheld. She did not say what she saw in the Countess's accounts. Not yet. She was 11 weeks from Michaelmas, and she had 22 shillings and a tin box, and the thing she had learned earliest and most thoroughly was how to be small in a room full of people who controlled her circumstances. She counted her observations the way she counted the shillings. She kept them. The Duke returned on a Thursday in late June, arriving in the early dark with a retinue reduced to 2 outriders and a valet who had the battered efficiency of a man who had spent the last fortnight sleeping in different beds. Agnes was crossing the upper gallery with a book for the Countess when she heard the carriage below and paused at the window in the honest curiosity of someone who has not expected the sound. She saw him climb down without waiting for the step. She saw him stop in the middle of the courtyard and look up at the house the way a person looks at something they are not sure is still theirs. That look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and he went inside, and Agnes turned back to the corridor with a feeling she did not immediately name, having long practice at declining to name things. He sent for her the following morning. She had not expected that either. His study was north-facing and arranged for work rather than reception, papers weighted with river-smooth stones, a shelf of ledgers in matching calfskin, a window that looked out not at the park but at the kitchen gardens, where, at that hour, 2 men were turning the soil between the bean rows. He was standing at the window when she entered, and turned only when the door closed. "Miss Vane." He looked at her with the directness of a man who had decided to treat her as a person of sense. "My sister tells me you've been keeping her accounts. I have been assisting the Countess with her quarterly reconciliations, Your Grace. I'm told you found a discrepancy." Agnes held the word in the air between them for a moment. "I noticed some figures that bore further examination. I imagine you noticed rather more than that." He moved to the desk but did not sit. He stood with one hand resting on the near edge of it, and she had the impression of a man choosing how close to a thing he was willing to stand. "What did you notice?" She was aware that this was a question she had not been certain she would ever be asked, and also that the asking of it carried its own risk, because if she was wrong, she would lose her situation and her 22 shillings would not last until Michaelmas, and if she was right, she would lose her situation, and something considerably larger than that might break apart. She had spent the previous 12 days deciding what she would say if it was asked. She said it. The quarterly receipts from the Countess's settlement have been approximately 14% short of the contracted sum for at least 3 years. The shortfall is consistent and follows no pattern I can attribute to legitimate deductions. It corresponds to a disbursement that appears in the supplementary ledger as a management fee, authorized, as far as I can determine, by a document I have not been permitted to see. The Duke was very still. It was the stillness she had observed at the dinner table, the night of the Latin, not the stillness of a man who has been told something he did not know, but the stillness of a man who has been told something he already knew and had not expected to hear spoken aloud by someone who cost him nothing. "You have not mentioned this to anyone else?" "No, Your Grace." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because I was not certain what use would be made of it," she said, "and I have some interest in its being put to the right use." He was quiet for a moment longer. The men in the kitchen garden traded some remark she couldn't hear. A blackbird went off in the hedgerow, a sound like a dropped key, bright and sudden and gone. "You'll say nothing further of this for now," he said at last. "Not to my sister, not to anyone in this house. I had already decided as much. And you'll continue with the accounts, if you wish it." "I wish it." He picked up a letter from the desk, then set it down again, not reading it, only giving his hands something to do. "Is there anything you require for that work?" Agnes thought of her tin box. She thought of Michaelmas. "Only continued access to the supplementary ledger," she said, "which I have been told is not available to me. It will be available to you tomorrow morning." She nodded, made her curtsy, and went to the door. His voice stopped her. "Miss Vane." She turned. "At my table," he said. The first evening, something moved in the back of his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. Cicero's letters, not his speeches. "I thought it was the appropriate register," Agnes said. The thing that was adjacent to amusement came slightly forward. "So did I." He looked back at the window. "That will be all." She went back along the corridor with her hands quiet at her sides, and the blackbird's call still arranged in her mind like the first line of a proof. The supplementary ledger was worse than she had allowed herself to expect. She had permitted herself an expectation of irregularity. What she found was architecture, a whole constructed system of small redirections, so consistent in their method that the hand that had built them was unmistakable, even though the hand had taken considerable care to be no particular hand at all. The management fee appeared under varying descriptions: maintenance of trust instruments, annual assessment, administration charge. The amounts varied enough to avoid pattern at a glance, and aligned precisely enough, if you laid 12 quarters side by side, to produce a single unwavering percentage. 14%. 3 years at minimum. Possibly 5. The earliest records available to her went back only 3. She worked on the ledger in the mornings and read to the Countess in the evenings, and ate her meals in the small sitting room attached to her bedroom, because the weather had turned hot, and the dining room was not made more comfortable by Lord Fenwick, who was a long-standing guest of the sort, who never explained why he was still present. Twice she encountered the Duke in the corridor between the library and the north staircase. Both times he stopped, Both times he asked one question, the phrasing precise, the subject the ledger, and listened to her answer without interrupting, and went on. It was Mrs. Partridge who first said the thing aloud. Mrs. Partridge was the housekeeper, 60-odd, with the compressed authority of a woman who had held a great house together through 4 changes of tenure and 2 floods and knew more about the family than most of the family. She had taken against Agnes at first on principle. Companions were neither servants nor gentry, and had a habit of eating the house from inside, and had revised her assessment over the matter of the sugar stores and a visiting nephew, and the remarkable economy with which Agnes had resolved the situation without anyone's dignity requiring rescue. She stopped Agnes in the linen passage on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of the Duke's return. The accounts, she said, without preamble. Agnes waited. I'm not asking what you found, Mrs. Partridge folded her hands at her waist. I can see what you found by the look you don't have on your face. I am asking what you intend to do about it. I intend to do whatever the Duke instructs, Agnes said. Mrs. Partridge studied her for a moment with the calm of a woman who has assessed a great many things. That's a good answer, she said at last. It's also not entirely true. She unfolded her hands and picked up the top sheet from the linen stack she'd been carrying. There are people in this house who've been watching that ledger for 5 years, Miss Vane, and who could not do what you are doing with it because they could not read it, and because no one with the authority to ask them had thought to ask. Agnes was quiet. The Countess is not well, said Mrs. Partridge in a different tone, lower, stripped of its housekeeper's precision. She has not been well for 2 years, and the not being well is, she stopped. Consistent, Agnes said carefully. Mrs. Partridge met her eyes. 14% short, she said. And consistent. The linen passage was very still. Somewhere below them, a kitchen door banged shut. Agnes's understanding, which had been arranged around figures and accounting methodology, rearranged itself around something older and colder and considerably more dangerous, and she stood with it for 3 seconds while the whole shape of the thing became visible to her all at once, and she did not let any of it reach her face. Thank you, Mrs. Partridge, she said at last. The accounts, said Mrs. Partridge, picking up her stack. That is all I said. It was not all she had said. They both knew it. She went down the back stair, and Agnes stood in the linen passage with her hands very still at her sides, and thought about the packet of dried herbs she had found on her 3rd day, tucked behind the books in the Countess's sitting room, and the particular bitterness the Countess's tea had on warm days, and the headaches that came after it, and the visits that preceded the headaches, and the hands that poured the tea. She went to find the Duke that afternoon with a piece of information she had not told him before, and she did not find him in his study. She found him instead in the kitchen garden, working with his sleeves rolled to the elbow on the north-facing wall, where the espalier pears were being trained back into their wires. He was working beside the head gardener with the competence of a man who had done it before, and the head gardener was talking to him the way the head gardener talked to no one else in the house, which is to say as a person. She stood at the garden gate and waited until the natural pause. He came to her. He did not roll down his sleeves. He wiped his hands on a cloth the gardener handed him, and he looked at her, and she thought, he already knows that I know something. The face of a man receiving a blow, without letting his face report it. Not the accounts, he said. The Countess's tea, Agnes said. And then, because there was no version of this that was not terrible, and because she had decided 3 days ago in the linen passage that there was no way through this except through the middle of it, I believe someone has been putting something into it. I believe the headaches are not the Countess's own. I believe they have been given to her, and I believe I can prove it if I am permitted to take the packet from behind the sitting-room bookshelf to Sir Edmund Crail, who I am told has some knowledge of botanical pharmacology." The Duke was very still for a long time. "Yes," he said. "There is a second thing," Agnes said. He waited. "Whatever I find, and whatever is done about it, I want your word that the Countess will not be permitted to know, until after she is well, the full extent of who did this to her." She looked at him steadily. She loves him. Whatever he has done, she will need to be very well before she can be given the loss of it. The Duke looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "Him," he said. Agnes had not said a name. She would not say it aloud here in the garden with the afternoon open around them. "The accounts," she said, "point in one direction." A muscle worked in his jaw. He turned away and looked at the espalier pears, which did not give him anything, and then he turned back. "You have my word," he said, "about my sister." He paused. "And I will say this once. What you have done, what you are doing, is done at considerable personal risk, and I am aware of it. And I am aware that you had no obligation beyond what you were paid." Agnes thought of 22 shillings. She thought of Michaelmas. "I had one obligation," she said, "which was to a woman who has been kind to me, and who is being harmed, and who cannot see it. That is not an obligation that came from the wage." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said at last, "I imagine it did not." He went back to the pears. Agnes went back to the house, and she thought that the first of his laughs she had heard, or the thing adjacent to a laugh, that small exhaled acknowledgement, had happened there in the kitchen garden, and that it had sounded like relief. What followed was 3 weeks of patience, which was the hardest work Agnes had ever done. Sir Edmund received the dried packet with the careful hands of a man who had been waiting for someone to bring him precisely this. He gave no indication of hurry. He examined the contents over 4 days in his room, with the door closed and the windows latched, and he emerged on the 5th morning and went directly to the Duke's study and remained there for an hour and a half. Agnes was not present. She knew only what Mrs. Partridge communicated through the medium of where she did and did not place Agnes's morning tea, which was a language Agnes had learned in the first fortnight, and which was, she had decided, the most dependable channel of intelligence in the house. The Countess's tea changed. It was done without drama and without announcement. Agnes simply ensured, from the 3rd week, that the tea the Countess drank was tea Agnes herself had prepared, and the Countess's headaches began, with the slow reliability of something allowed to heal rather than forced, to ease. Cornelius visited twice during this period. The first visit he was easy and charming as always, kissing his sister's hand and bringing her sweet biscuits from the confectioner in the village and staying through dinner, where he told a story about a horse that made Mrs. Stanhope laugh until she cried. Agnes watched his hands. He had the hands of a man who had learned very early that the world would smooth itself for him, and who had never been required to revise that education. He poured his sister's tea with perfect solicitude. His eyes did not go to Agnes. She was furniture. She had always been furniture to him, and she had understood, from the first week, that this was his single most consequential error. The second visit was 8 days before the reckoning. He was less easy. He arrived without the biscuits and stayed only through luncheon, and at luncheon he asked, in the gentlest voice in the room, whether the accounts for the quarter were nearly reconciled, as the steward in London was pressing for the annual summary. "Nearly," Agnes said, without looking up from the Countess's embroidery, which she was untangling. Cornelius looked at her for a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, with an expression that was still gentle and had gone, just perceptibly elsewhere, He looked away. Agnes returned to the embroidery and counted the threads she had to work with, which was 3 colors and a good deal of patience, which had always been the same problem. He offered her the bribe 4 days later. He did it in the South Passage after luncheon, very quietly, with the air of a man extending a courtesy. "You are clearly a woman of considerable intelligence, Miss Vane." The voice remained gentle. "I would be grateful if that intelligence could be applied to the quarterly accounts with the practical understanding that certain arrangements, being established over many years, are beyond the scope of a companion's reconciliation work. A considerable sum, relative to your present wage, could be settled on you in return for a version of the accounts that reflects that understanding." Agnes stood with her hands at her sides. The South Passage was not quite private. Through the window she could see one of the undergardeners working the border. She looked at Cornelius Ashmore, and she thought about Michaelmas and her tin box and her mother's creditors, and she felt the weight of it plainly, without drama, the way she had felt it every morning since she arrived. "No," she said. He was silent. "I understand what you are offering," Agnes said, "and I understand what you are not offering, which is any guarantee that the arrangement would remain as you describe it, rather than becoming leverage of a different kind when the need arose. I have been poor enough, long enough, to know the shape of a transaction that acquires new terms at the other party's convenience. I am not interested." Cornelius looked at her for a long moment. The gentleness had not left his face. It was very practiced. "You are making an error," he said at last. "I have made them before," Agnes said. "I prefer mine to yours." She went back to the sitting room. Her hands were not shaking. She was, she noted, rather more frightened than her hands suggested, and she was also, which surprised her, very clear. She sat down and resumed the Countess's embroidery, and she thought through the middle. In the light. With witnesses. There was no other way. Mrs. Partridge came to her room that night, after the household was quiet, and sat on the chair by the window without being invited, because she was Mrs. Partridge. "He'll move before the quarter ends," Mrs. Partridge said. "I know. He'll try the accounts directly. There's a copy in his possession." Agnes looked up. "I know that too." Mrs. Partridge studied her. "You've prepared for it. Sir Edmund has a true copy," Agnes said. "Annotated, in his own hand, which is known to every institution in 3 counties. She paused. "And the Duke has the signed receipt for the document Cornelius told him did not exist." Mrs. Partridge was quiet for a moment. "The management authority." "Which was not signed by the Duke," Agnes said. "Which was signed by a clerk in the London office who has since, very recently, found himself employed elsewhere, and which I found in the supplementary ledger behind a false page." She set down the embroidery. "It is behind a false page, because someone put it there for safekeeping and did not have time to remove it before I was given access." The quiet in the room was the quiet of a loaded gun that has not yet been pointed. "He made a mistake," Mrs. Partridge said. "He made the mistake that people make when they believe someone is furniture," Agnes said. "He left things in plain view because plain view is not visible to furniture." Mrs. Partridge looked at her for a long time. Then she stood, smoothed her apron, and said, "Miss Vane." "Yes, I will be available tomorrow," she said, "for whatever you require." Agnes nodded. "I know," she said. "I am relying on it." The reckoning came on a Friday morning, which had not been planned for a Friday morning, but which arrived that way, because Cornelius moved 3 days early. Agnes heard the sound of it from the south corridor, a voice raised, which was unusual enough in that house to stop her where she stood, and then the Duke's voice beneath it, very quiet, and then a third voice she needed a moment to place, because it was not a voice she had heard raised before. It belonged to Fenwick. She had not expected Fenwick. She considered this for approximately 4 seconds, and then she thought, no. Not unexpected. Think about who has been here longest. Think about whose losses would be recouped if the management arrangement were sound. Think about who borrowed and who has not repaid it. She went to the study. She opened the door without knocking, which she had never done, and the room came into focus like a scene she had been watching from far away that had suddenly closed to arm's length. The Duke stood behind his desk. Cornelius stood before it. Fenwick stood to the right of the door, by the bookcase, and he looked at Agnes with the expression of a man who has been caught at a calculation. Sir Edmund sat in the corner armchair with the particular stillness of a man who has been asked to witness something and intends to do it thoroughly. Mrs. Partridge was already inside, by the window. Agnes had not seen her arrive. She did not ask. "Miss Vane," said Cornelius. His voice had not recovered the gentleness yet. "This does not concern you." "The accounts concern me," Agnes said. She walked to the desk and set down the 2 items she had brought from her room, a small cloth-wrapped packet and an envelope. "Your Grace." The Duke looked at her. "The first," she said, "is the false page from the supplementary ledger, with the management authority document behind it. The signature on the management authority is not yours. Sir Edmund has examined it and can speak to that comparison, as he has a signed letter from you in his possession for reference." She looked at Sir Edmund. "I can and will," said Sir Edmund pleasantly. "The second," Agnes said, "is a letter." She did not open it yet. "Written by Lord Fenwick to Mr. Cornelius Ashmore, dated 4 months before the management arrangement was established, outlining the expected return on the investment." The letter was kept. She looked at Fenwick. "You were right to consider that she was not clever. You were wrong about which she you were considering." Fenwick's color had changed. He opened his mouth. "The Countess kept it," Agnes said. She did not know what it meant. She thought it was a business matter. She kept everything her brother sent her because she loves him. I found it among her personal papers, which she asked me to organize, and which I organized, and which I read because it is not possible to organize papers without reading them, and because she asked me to look for anything important." She looked at Cornelius. "She asked me 3 months ago. She forgot she had asked me. She has been very unwell." The room was very quiet. "The herbal packet," Agnes said, "is in Sir Edmund's custody and has been for 3 weeks, along with his written analysis. He will speak to that as well." "I will," said Sir Edmund, in the same pleasant tone. Cornelius said, in a voice from which all the gentleness had now gone, "This is a fabrication by a woman with a grudge and a— Cornelius, it was the Duke. He said the name the way you say the name of something finished. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. He picked up the false page from the desk and held it to the window light, and the movement was so deliberate and so unhurried that the rest of the room seemed to slow to match it. He looked at the document for a long time. He set it down. "You are going to be quiet," he said. "You are going to sit in that chair, and you are going to listen while Sir Edmund reads what is in front of him, because it is going to be read in this room today before witnesses, and the question of what follows is the only question remaining." Cornelius sat. He sat the way a man sits when his legs have made the decision without him. Sir Edmund read. He read the analysis of the packet's contents, the identification of the herb, the known dosage effects, the correlation between exposure and the specific symptoms the Countess had presented across 2 years, in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had spent 30 years writing reports that would be examined by people looking for errors, and had found in his current document no errors to find. He read the comparison of the signatures, with specific reference to the letter forms the forger had handled correctly and the ones they had not. He read the letter between Fenwick and Cornelius, which had the quality of Fenwick's voice, polished, euphemistic, very careful, and which was, nonetheless, unmistakable in its terms. When he had finished, the room was quiet again. Agnes looked at Fenwick. She said, "There is one question I should like to ask you." Fenwick looked back at her. His expression had reorganized itself into something she recognized, the expression of a man deciding which version of the truth is survivable. "The letter," she said. "You will recall that in the second paragraph you refer to prior arrangement. The arrangement from before." She waited. "I should like to know what that arrangement was, and specifically whether it predates the Countess's marriage." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences before it. Fenwick looked at the Duke. He looked at the door. He looked at his own hands. Agnes watched his face, and she saw, very clearly, the arithmetic completing itself and the answer arriving. And the answer was that there was no version of this that was survivable except one, and that one required him to speak now, and speak truly, and hope that true speaking bought something the false kind no longer could. "It predates the marriage," Fenwick said. He did not look up. "By 4 years." The Duke's hands were still on the desk. They remained still. Agnes thought, this is what it costs to hold perfectly still. This is the visible price of it. "Leave this house," the Duke said to Fenwick at last. "You have until this evening. You will not return. There will be no legal proceeding against you on the condition that you make no public statement about this family, and no claim against any person in it. That is the condition." He paused. "You should know that I am making it for the sake of my sister's name, and not for yours." Fenwick nodded. He stood and went to the door and opened it and went through it. He did not look back. The room's attention turned to Cornelius. He was sitting in the chair she had put him in with his hands on his knees and his face doing something complicated, cycling through arrangements of expression as though looking for one that fit and finding none that did. Agnes watched the moment when he stopped looking. What came through instead was not guilt and not fear. It was something older and smaller than either. It was grief. The grief of a man who had wanted something very particular and had built his entire machinery to get it, and who could now see, from where he was sitting, that the machinery was all he had become. She had not expected to feel sorry for him. She found that she did, and she also found that the sorrow did not change what had been done or what needed to follow. It was the Duke who spoke. He did not speak for a long time first. When he did, his voice was careful in the way of a man who has decided what he will and will not allow himself. "You will receive the quarterly allowance your position entitles you to," he said, "as my sister's brother. Nothing beyond it. You will have no role in the management of this estate or any account attached to it. You will live where you choose, within England, provided that the 2 conditions are met. You do not approach my sister without her express request, and you make no claim to anyone that this family owes you more than what you receive." He paused. "If you break either condition, what is in Sir Edmund's custody becomes a matter for the magistrate. If you keep them, it does not." Cornelius looked up at him. Something passed across his face. The thing Agnes had watched move through Fenwick too, the arithmetic of the survivable. "Why?" he said. The word was almost nothing, barely enough to carry the question. The Duke looked at him with an expression that was not warm and was not cold, and that had, Agnes thought, been arrived at across a great distance. "Because she loves you," he said simply. "She will ask me to be generous. I am being generous now, so that when she asks, the answer is already yes." Cornelius stood. He left the room without speaking again. The door closed behind him very quietly. The remaining 4 people in the room, the Duke, Sir Edmund, Mrs. Partridge, and Agnes, stayed where they were for a moment as the silence settled into a different kind of silence, the kind that follows the end of something rather than the anticipation of what comes next. Sir Edmund uncrossed his legs and rose from the armchair with the unhurried ease of a man in perfect conscience. "Well," he said. He looked at Agnes. "Your father was vain of Peterhouse, was he not? The natural philosophy lectures." "He was," Agnes said. "I attended one of those lectures," Sir Edmund said, "in 1890. "Very fine." He picked up his papers and tucked them under his arm. "I imagine he would have been pleased to know the use you've made of what he taught you." He bowed to the room in general and went out. Mrs. Partridge met Agnes's eyes from across the room. Agnes saw something in them that was precise and brief, and she thought very nearly a smile. Then Mrs. Partridge said, in her housekeeper's voice, "I shall see about luncheon," and followed Sir Edmund out and closed the door behind her, and the room had only 2 people in it. Agnes was conscious, suddenly, of the specific quality of the quiet. It was the quiet of a room in which everything that needed to be said in front of other people had been said, and she was still in it, and the Duke was still in it, and he was looking at her from the other side of the desk with an expression she had no immediate name for. She thought of 22 shillings. She thought of Michaelmas, which was 3 weeks away. She made her curtsy and went to the door. Agnes, her name. Not Miss Vane. She stopped. She turned. He came around the desk. He did this without hurry, and he stopped at a distance that was respectful and was also not very far, and he looked at her with the particular directness she had catalogued from the first conversation in this room, the directness of a man who had decided to treat her as a person of sense and had continued, across all the weeks and the accounts and the kitchen garden and the South Passage, to revise upward what a person of sense was worth. "I told you once," he said, "that I was aware you had no obligation beyond what you were paid. You did. I owe you a great deal more than what you were paid." "You do not," Agnes said. "What was done here was owed to your sister. What was owed to you was repaid in the work." "The work," he said, "was not the whole of it." He looked at her steadily. "You refused the bribe. I was aware you knew about that." "Partridge," he said very briefly. "Partridge," Agnes agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the expression settle into something that was, she thought, the thing that had been approaching for a long time. Through the kitchen garden and the north corridor, and the 2 weeks of patient silence, and the morning in the study when she had stood there with a piece of terrible information and given it to him straight. "I am not going to speak to you about this now," he said. "There is a great deal that needs to happen first, and some of it involves my sister, and you were right that she needs to be very well before she is given any of it. But I want you to know," he stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment in the way of a man checking the quality of what he is about to say. Then he looked back up. "I want you to know that when all of it has happened, and you are free to answer me honestly, I intend to ask you a question, and the answer I want is the answer you actually give." Agnes looked at him. The thing she had been not naming since the kitchen garden, since the north corridor, since the first evening in the dining room when he had not laughed, that thing made itself, now, quietly and completely, known to her. "I will answer you honestly," she said. "I always do." Something happened in his face, not the laugh, not yet, but the thing that was always adjacent to it, and closer now than she had seen it. "I know," he said. "It is among your most alarming qualities." She went back to the Countess. The Countess recovered over the turning of the season, slowly and then with increasing confidence, the way a thing grows when the interference is simply removed. Agnes watched her return to herself in small increments, the way she began to take her tea without wincing, the way the headaches came less frequently and then rarely, and then stopped, the way she laughed at her uncle's stories again and sat in the garden in the afternoon without the heavy-lidded exhaustion that had been attributed for 2 years to her constitution. Agnes told her nothing of what had happened, as she had promised. She told her, when asked about Cornelius's sudden absence, that he had found it necessary to take a house in the south for his health, which was true insofar as it went, and left the rest for a time when the Countess would be stronger. The Countess accepted this in the way of a woman who has not yet asked herself the question that would require a harder answer. The Duke and Agnes were frequently in the same room. This had always been the case. It became, over those weeks of the Countess's recovery, a different kind of frequentness, one that was sought rather than circumstantial on both sides, and conducted with the particular decorum of two people who have said what they have said and are waiting for the time to be right. He gave her a letter from Sir Edmund to read one September morning in the library, which concerned the legal instruments surrounding the Countess's settlement and what Sir Edmund had arranged. He gave it to her over a chess problem they had been working through together for 3 sessions, without either of them being particularly interested in chess, and she read it while he placed the pieces and handed it back and said, "He has done well by her." "He has," the Duke said, and moved the bishop. "Her income will be restored in full," Agnes said. "From the arrears forward, yes," she looked at him. "And the prior arrears?" He looked at the board, made good from another source. She understood without requiring it explained. "You should not have done that," she said. "No," he agreed. He moved the bishop again. "It is also done." She looked at the board for a moment. "You have left your queen entirely exposed," she said. He looked up at her. "Have I?" he said, and his voice was different. "You have," Agnes said. She picked up the opposing knight. She held it for a moment. Then she put it down, not on the board, beside it. "It would be unsporting," she said, "given the circumstances." He looked at the knight beside the board for a long time. Then he looked at her, and it happened. Fully, finally, the thing that had been adjacent for 3 months. He laughed. It was not a grand laugh or a performed one. It was quiet and a little startled and entirely real, and it changed his face entirely. And Agnes thought, there it is. There it is, and it was worth every day of the 3 months. "Agnes," he said. "It is not yet time," she said. "You said so yourself." "I know what I said." He was still almost laughing. "I said I would ask when you were free to answer honestly. I should not have said it as a promise, because you have held me to it with considerable precision." "I have held you to it with the only precision I have," she said. "The precision," he said, "is considerable." He did not ask her that evening. He asked her 6 weeks later, on an afternoon in late October when the kitchen garden had been put to bed for winter, and they were walking back from looking at the espalier pears, which had done well enough to satisfy the head gardener, which was not an easy thing to do. He asked her very simply, looking at her rather than the garden, his voice at its quietest, which was when it was most itself. "I am going to ask you now," he said. Agnes looked at the pear trees. "I know. Then you know what I mean to ask." "I have known for some time," she said. "Have you known the answer as long?" She looked at him. "Longer," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The blackbird went off somewhere in the hedgerow, the same sound it had made in June, the dropped key call, bright and brief. "I have no elegant version of this," he said. "I have never been able to say things in the elegant version. I am asking you to marry me because I have wanted to ask you for months, and because I am a better person when you are in the room, and because what you did for my sister and for this house came from something in you that I have no word large enough for. But I want you to know." He stopped. "I want you to know that I am not asking because of any of those reasons. I am asking because I want you. Because when I imagine the rest of my life, I can only hold the image steady when you are in it." He looked at her steadily. "Marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." Agnes was quiet for a moment. The pear trees were bare and regular against the stone wall. The blackbird had gone quiet too. "I wish it," she said. "I have wished it since the kitchen garden in June, and I declined to name it because I was 11 weeks from my Kelmis, and there were 22 shillings in a tin box under my traveling trunk, and I did not want any version of this that came from having nothing else. And now?" "And now," she said, "I have enough to live on, as of Sir Edmund's arrangement, and I am asking you in full possession of other options, which means the answer is actually mine." She looked at him. Yes, he reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm, and as she had observed from the first, not a duke's hands. It was steady. "The blackbird," he said, after a moment. "I know," she said. "It was in June, too." "I noticed," he said. "I thought, if she notices it, we are the same kind of person." "I noticed it," she said. "I know," he said. "I saw you." They were married in December, on a morning of flat white light and no wind, in the village church where the vicar had been expecting the event for approximately 2 months and made no particular secret of his satisfaction. The wedding party was small. Sir Edmund Mrs. Partridge in a coat that was visibly new and for which she had accepted no compliments. The head gardener, because the Duke had asked him, and he had come without requiring a reason. The Countess in a grey wool dress with roses at the collar that she had embroidered herself in the weeks of her recovery, looking well, looking wholly herself. She wept at the moment the ring was placed, steadily and without apology. Mrs. Partridge, who had been maintaining an expression of professional neutrality, abandoned it somewhere around the same moment and wept too, and then caught herself and patted down her coat and returned to the expression, which deceived no one. Cornelius sent a letter. It was brief and formal and said nothing that was not appropriate to the occasion and nothing that was felt. The Duke showed it to Agnes. She read it. She folded it and gave it back. "He is sorry," she said. "It is in the way he has written around the word without using it." The Duke looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. "Yes," he said. He put the letter in the correspondence chest, where it would stay. The Countess was told the full account of what had happened in early spring, when the first light came back to the windows at a useful angle and the kitchen garden was being turned for planting. Agnes was with her. She told her plainly, without arrangement, and the Countess listened to all of it and said nothing during it and very little after it. What she said, at last, was, "I should have seen it." "No," Agnes said. "You were ill, and you trusted him because you loved him, which is what trust is." She paused. "He was not wrong that you loved him. He was only wrong about what could be built on it." The Countess was quiet for a long time. The light moved on the floor in the slow particular way of spring light still finding its angle. "And now?" she said at last. "And now," Agnes said, "he is somewhere in the south, and he receives his allowance, and he will receive it all his life, and you are well." She paused. "It is not an even account, but it is settled." The Countess looked at her for a moment. Then she said, with a small, very old smile, "You and my brother both." Speaking in ledgers. "It is the language we share," Agnes said. "I know," said the Countess. "I have always thought it was a love language with the two of you." She looked back at the light on the floor. "I suppose I shall have to learn it." Fenwick married, 2 years later, a woman in Edinburgh who was said to be sharp and good-tempered, and who knew precisely what she had acquired. Mrs. Partridge was given, at her own retirement 8 years after the events described, a cottage on the home farm that had been discreetly made ready for some time. A fact she professed to find outrageous, and accepted with a dignity that deceived no one. Sir Edmund published, in his 72nd year, a monograph on the botanical properties of herbs used medicinally in the early period that was dedicated to his niece, the Duchess, and contained in the acknowledgments one precise sentence about an unnamed young woman whose observational acuity had provided the occasion for the research. Agnes read it and said nothing to him for a week, at which point she told him it was the finest thing she had ever read in print, which was not entirely true, and which he received with exactly as much skepticism as it deserved. The redeemable rival turned out to be Fenwick, in the end, who sent a letter to the Duke in the spring of the 3rd year that was direct in its terms and specific in its acknowledgment of what had been done, and which asked for nothing. The Duke showed it to Agnes. She read it carefully. "He has become a better person," she said. "It happens," the Duke said. "Not always," Agnes said, "less often than people claim." She handed the letter back. "Write to him. It is worth acknowledging." The Duke wrote to him. Fenwick replied. The correspondence continued, occasional and measured, across the following years, the correspondence of two men who had not been friends, and were not quite friends, and who had arrived, by a route neither of them would have planned, at a mutual recognition that cost nothing now, and had cost something once. Agnes thought this was probably how most good things worked. Almost a year after the wedding, 10 months and some days, Agnes was crossing the upper gallery with a book for the Countess when she heard laughter from below, the good kind, the kind of a room in high spirits. She stopped at the window. In the courtyard below, the Duke was coming back from the kitchen garden with the head gardener beside him, and the two of them were laughing at something she couldn't hear, and she stood at the same window where she had watched him arrive in the dark a year ago, and she thought, he looked up at the house then and did not know if it was still his. He was not looking up now. He was laughing in the courtyard of his house without looking up at it at all. She could price that if she were keeping the ledger. She had, in fact, some experience. She stood at the window with the book for the Countess, and she thought, the accounts balance, not evenly, not without cost, not without the visible receipts of the years before, but balance. It will do. It is, in fact, more than enough. She went to find the Countess, who was in the sitting room with the roses growing outside the window and the tea ready and the headaches 2 years gone. Agnes sat down. The Countess poured. The tea was exactly what it was, nothing more, nothing less, and through the window the blackbird started up its business in the hedgerow, the dropped key call, the sound that had been here all along before either of them thought to listen for it. If this story kept a lantern burning for you, if you know what it is to carry a full account of things while the room looks through you, then you know why Agnes left the knight beside the board, and why the Duke counted it as the answer. Come and sit with us a while longer. The fire is still going, and I have kept a chair. Tell me in the comments the moment that stayed with you, when Agnes refused the bribe, when the blackbird went off the second time, when the Duke laughed in the courtyard, or name for me what you would have done in that south passage with Cornelius's offer on the table. If these stories are the ones you reach for at the end of the day, there is a place for you here, and the subscribe is simply how you hold it. Until then, sleep well, and be true to the ones who noticed you before you had anything to offer them.